A bad character of Quarreling, contesting authority on the revolutionary Pennsylvania frontier. The American Revolution manifested itself differently along the frontier than it did in the eastern portions of the colonies. The issues that motivated protests and riots in Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg were far removed from Pittsburgh and seemed mostly unimportant to local residents. Instead, the issues that moved people to action on the western Pennsylvania frontier were specific to the region and dramatically affected local responses to the revolution. Most importantly were the issues of security from Indian attacks and a lingering question of which state, Pennsylvania or Virginia, would control the region around Pittsburgh. Both states claimed Pittsburgh as their own, and both had created county governments and civil administrations to substantiate their rule. What resulted was a contested jurisdiction in which two local governments exercised public authority, making local government contested and weak. The Revolutionary War farther complicated this dynamic. The revolution did not end factional discord around Pittsburgh, but instead afforded new avenues for the continuation of the conflict. A contentious competition for power precluded attempts to establish legitimate authority in the region. As local settlers who had organized themselves into two adversarial factions prior to the revolution reacted to the struggle for independence in strict accordance with local definitions of what mattered. Thus, the region remained politically divided as settlers contested the authority of rival county governments and negotiated the extent of their allegiance. These divisions threatened to undermine the ability of Congress to provide security for the frontier. Indeed, as the revolution unfolded, local leaders would demonstrate that they had no intention of surrendering their local autonomy to Congress or to any other distant government. Although Congress established a Western military department at Pittsburgh and dispatched Army commanders to Fort Pitt, defense of the region remained primarily a matter of local initiative. This arose in part from Congress's inability or unwillingness to commit adequate resources for defense during the early years of the war. Congress considered the region around Pittsburgh to be peripheral to the main fight, which was shaping up along the Atlantic seaboard. It would not even divert manpower and materials from the east to defend the frontier. Instead, Congress envisioned a scenario where the region's inhabitants mobilized for their own defense, guided by a Continental Army commander at Pittsburgh. But managing the militia and the local population in general proved problematic. Civil authority around Pittsburgh remained divided and competitive during the war, making it very difficult for the Army to coordinate defense efforts. Local militia leaders often resisted Continental efforts to coordinate military affairs, which would have required the locals to recognize the Army's authority and accept limitations on their own autonomy. Conditioned by a growing distrust of distant authorities, the local population often viewed Congress and its representatives at Pittsburgh as competitors for power, even enemies who sacrificed the security of the settlements in favor of national objectives in the East. As Army commanders in Pittsburgh would learn, the frontier population was willing to fight, but only on its own terms. Nonetheless, in April 1777, Congress ordered General Edward Hand, a surgeon and former British officer, to assume command at Pittsburgh. Hand would command the new Western Department of the Continental Army, headquartered at Fort Pitt. But Congress sent no Continental troop soldiers with Hand. Without a detachment of soldiers to enforce his edicts and carry his plans into execution, Hand was forced to rely entirely on the local militia for manpower. Recruiting consumed much of his attention. While both Pennsylvania and Virginia gave Hand limited authorization to call out their frontier militia at the same time, Hand found the process exceedingly frustrating. With no centralized civilian authority in the region, Hand depended upon the county militia lieutenants to provide troops for his campaigns. Yet managing military leaders from the two competing counties was exasperating. Neither county housed their civilian administrations at Pittsburgh, which then made it difficult for Hand to communicate his needs to the militia captains. The closest county court was more than 30 miles away, making it necessary for Hand to travel into the country to stir up the people. Even greater difficulties arose once the militia took the field as the general and the county lieutenants argued over the militia's role. Hand envisioned the militia as an offensive force to be employed at his discretion, while the county lieutenants saw their militia primarily as a defensive force that should remain close to the settlements to protect their families. While Hand was perplexed by this behavior, the general failed to comprehend that the militia's actions were the product of an unstable frontier society that knew little about collective organization. Years of competition and conflict, most of it rooted in the dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia, had prevented any sense of community from taking hold in the region. Instead, the collective consciousness of the region was dominated by political factionalism and the pursuit of self-interest, objectives that precluded settlers from protecting one another or the larger community. Within the two dominant political factions, the local population viewed the war only in terms of the immediate threat to themselves. This individualistic orientation would become more and more prominent as the war continued, making efforts to coordinate defense increasingly difficult. The self-serving attitude of the local population had developed in large part because of the long absence of stable institutions of authority. The jurisdictional dispute had made effective governance of the region impossible, leaving local settlers to fend for themselves in nearly all phases of their existence. Not surprisingly, they had little inclination to follow the direction of a seemingly arbitrary national government, unless it might gain them some advantage in the local competition for power. Shortly after his arrival in Pittsburgh, Hand learned that many local militia leaders expected him to resolve the jurisdictional dispute, with each faction assuming he would rule in their favor. The prospect of fixing a permanent boundary between Virginia and Pennsylvania gives the people much satisfaction, Hand observed. Next to chastising the Indians, they desire that may take place. But Hand himself remained distant from the conflict. He had been cautioned that the commanding officer at Fort Pitt should be utterly free from all prejudices or interest in the disputes between Pennsylvania and Virginia. When approached by proponents of the Virginia faction shortly after his arrival, Hand made it clear that he required a perfect union and harmony among the frontier inhabitants and considered the continuation of any local feud dangerous and disaffected to the American cause. This aloof attitude earned him few friends among local leaders who controlled the militia that Hand so desperately needed for defense. Hand also struggled with the local militia's attachment to independent action. In August of 1777, a group of militiamen at Pittsburgh commandeered several boats and decided to launch their own expedition into the Ohio country. When Hand tried to detain them, they informed the general that they were not under any directions but their own and threatened to return home if they were not allowed liberty to range where they pleased. In addition, county militia units routinely appeared as scheduled at Fort Pitt to receive supplies and provisions, but then seldom reported for garrison or patrol duty. They served when and where they chose, which often did not extend beyond their own settlements. Their refusal to recognize Hand's authority convinced the general that the region was plagued by disobedience and the greatest contempt of all authority. Such difficulties quickly defeated Hand, and during the spring of 1778, he asked Congress to relieve him of command. George Washington then appointed Lachlan McIntosh of Georgia as Hand's successor. The commander-in-chief grumbled about his inability to spare any troops for frontier defense, but eventually released the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment, comprised principally of Westmoreland County residents from the main army, and sent them with McIntosh to Pittsburgh. Yet the total number of Continental soldiers under McIntosh's command numbered fewer than 300 men, and ammunition and provisions still remained scarce. McIntosh continued to plead with Washington to send more troops west, but Washington could spare no additional men. I'm sorry to find that more vigorous measures have not been pursued for promoting the objects of your command, Washington informed McIntosh. But at present, the situation of affairs here will not permit my doing more than I already have. Predisposed to dislike his command from the start, McIntosh struggled to reconcile continental military objectives with the demands of the frontier population. McIntosh failed to understand that the mechanics of command in the region required a delicate appeasement of local interests. Only by catering to local agendas could the Continental Army commanders solicit support from the region's inhabitants. Yet McIntosh's interaction with local civilian leaders and county militia captains became overtly antagonistic. He dictated rather than requested, threatened instead of negotiating, and alienated the very men he needed the most. In turn, local militia leaders quickly came to despise McIntosh's ignorant, absurd, and contradictory conduct and orders. Even McIntosh's second-in-command, Colonel Daniel Brodhead, remarked that General McIntosh is unfortunate enough to be almost universally hated by every man in this department, both civil and military. It was thus hardly a surprise when the Continental Congress recalled the ineffective commander after less than a year in command. Now, the failure of Hand and McIntosh demonstrated to Congress that the West Country is under a bad character of quarreling with the generals sent to command them. Yet Congress remained largely ignorant of the circumstances that produced these conditions. Like their generals at Pittsburgh, Congress failed to see that the locals' resistance to Continental authority was rooted in their distinctive frontier logic, one that emphasized local power over all other forms of authority. Rather than address the fundamental problems plaguing the western Pennsylvania frontier, Congress instead concluded that the divided and contentious local population simply needed better management. In Congress's estimation, the situation could be brought under control by appointing an officer who understood the mindset of the disaffected settlers and could bring them to a sense of their duty. George Washington believed such a man existed in Colonel Daniel Brodhead, McIntosh's lieutenant, who hailed from a frontier settlement in central Pennsylvania, a background that Washington hoped would provide Brodhead a perspective when dealing with the region's inhabitants. It was a hopeful but unfortunately ultimately flawed assessment. Brodhead had been in the region for a year prior to assuming command in Pittsburgh and had developed an intense dislike for the county militia leaders. Coordinating defense with the independent-minded militia was, in Brodhead's estimation, enough to destroy the patience of Job. Brodhead understood that he needed the local population to support his military endeavors with provisions and volunteer troops, but he was no more prepared to negotiate the terms of their service than had been Hand or McIntosh. Since his primary task was to protect the settlements from Indian raids, Brodhead expected the local population to help facilitate that end and, more importantly, to follow his lead. Local militia leaders saw the situation quite differently. Cooperation, in their estimation, required that the general show sympathy for their concerns, and more precisely that he display his willingness to subordinate national agendas to the local needs. The settlers believed that they should make the important decisions regarding the region's defense themselves, And just as they had done while Hand and McIntosh commanded the region, county militia leaders refused to offer either material or manpower support for any campaign that did not closely mesh with their concepts of how the war should be fought. This stance puzzled Brodhead as much as it had his predecessors, because like them, he did not understand there was a fundamental lack of trust at work. The local population had never known an amicable relationship with any distant authority, and as a result, the locals sharply distrusted authority figures with no direct connection to the region, and they could never be induced to accept the guiding hand of extra-regional authority if they perceived such outside influence to be at odds with their own interests. Brodhead wanted to coordinate the military's activities with those of the Continental troops, which was sound military judgment, but was a futile strategy because it deprived the locals of their autonomy of action. The fragmented, self-attuned mentality of local society could not allow the county militia lieutenants to subordinate themselves to Brodhead's authority, especially when he tried to remove the militia from the security of its home neighborhood. Instead, the local inhabitants preferred to direct military affairs according to their own designs, even if the results were detrimental to defense of the region. As the standoff dragged on and the stubbornness of the locals combined with Brodhead's imperious attitude to produce military stagnation, Brodhead lacked the necessary manpower and provisions to succeed, while the locals didn't have the experience or the strategic vision to counter their Indian adversaries. Both had the power to give the other what they needed, but disputes over authority prevented any united action. As the war intensified, Washington ordered Brodhead to conserve his dwindling resources, cancel all proposed offensive campaigns, and simply cover and protect the country on a defensive plan. Brodhead immediately protested. "There is nothing I so much dread. We have never suffered half that I expected we should, and I am willing to suffer much more for the glorious cause for which I have and wish to bleed." Material considerations provided another problem. Food became the critical issue. Local farmers had managed to grow plenty of food during the war, but convincing them to sell their produce to the Army proved almost impossible. Local suppliers refused to provide Brodhead with exclusive rights to purchase their crops, and instead sold their wares to whomever they chose. A frustrated Brodhead predicted he would be powerless to oppose a British invasion of the region if his supply shortages were not overcome, as no person can be stupid enough to suppose that these troops, more than the others, can subsist upon wind. Local support dropped to a new point late in 1780. While the harvest that season was strong, a late summer drought dropped the river levels so low that the grist mills could not process the grain into flour. Local farmers worsened the situation by refusing to sell any excess flour to the Continental Army. The resulting bread shortage paralyzed military operations, and as the situation worsened, Washington authorized Brodhead to impress whatever provisions he needed to feed his increasingly despondent troops. Impress, I guess, in this case means confiscate. Brodhead did not want to impress provisions from the locals, as he realized that the settler population would interpret such a move as an attack upon their well-being by an uncaring and unsympathetic national government. Necessity, however, eventually spurred him to action. Still, he cautioned his troops to impress only surplus foodstuffs and to issue receipts for future reimbursement. Moreover, Brodhead explicitly told his officers on no pretense take from the poorer people or from those who have suffered by the enemy. It did not matter. Polite impressment was still impressment, and the local population resisted fervently. The settlers hid their flour, drove their livestock into the forest, and threatened impressment parties with violence if they tried to appropriate their food stores. Brodhead had little choice other than to recall the impressment parties. Otherwise, he feared the prosecution of compulsory means will be productive of bloodshed among our own citizens. Not surprisingly, Brodhead's inability to reconcile himself to the local population's self-attuned outlook eventually cost the colonel his position as commander of the Western Department. Despite the high hopes of George Washington and the Continental Congress, he had never been overly popular, especially in Pittsburgh itself. Brodhead's measures might have been accepted military practices of the time, but the local settlers viewed them as oppressive. As such, Pittsburgh residents celebrated the news of Brodhead's recall by burning the unfortunate colonel in effigy. Brodhead's removal from Pittsburgh underscored the growing inability of any extra-regional authority to even begin to control the western Pennsylvania frontier. Because there had never been an effective, uncontested governing presence here, settlers based their relationship with authority upon a prescribed set of circumstances that mandated the predominance of local autonomy. As they migrated to the region and occupied its lands, the settlers had learned to do for themselves without the aid, assistance, or protection of government. Local interests and their determination to pursue them as they chose were all that these people had ever known. Indeed, the presence of government, fleeting as it had been, had more often than not served to impede their liberties instead of securing them. Thus, when non-local authorities tried to exercise power that conflicted with the settlers' interests, as often occurred during the war, the settlers would not cooperate. It was an entirely predictable response, given that contention had always been such a prominent part of local society. The challenge of dealing with the local population finally fell to Brodhead's replacement, General William Irvine. Yet another physician-turned-soldier, Irvine had been active in the Continental Army since 1776 and had seen duty during the American invasion of Canada and in the campaigns along the Atlantic coast. However, he was passed over for service with the American Army, heading south to confront the British in Virginia, and instead sent to Pittsburgh to manage the defense of the western Pennsylvania frontier. Irvine disliked the assignment from the outset and didn't hesitate to let those around him feel his displeasure. There never was, nor I hope will there ever be, such a wretched, villainous place as this, he informed his wife. I don't remember any part of my life spent to such little purpose as at present. Much of Irvine's discontent stemmed from the seemingly insurmountable obstacles he faced in the region. The local population was obstinate, uncooperative, and antagonistic. Fort Pitt was in disrepair. Indian war parties struck the settlements with impunity, and the scattering of regular soldiers under his command were poorly equipped, underfed, unpaid, and more than a little mutinous. I never saw troops cut so truly deplorable and at the same time despicable a figure. No man could believe they were soldiers. Nay, it would be difficult to determine if they were even white men. Nonetheless, Irvine pushed forward by imposing strict military discipline on his troops and set them to repairing Fort Pitt. His efforts to build accommodation with the local population, however, were less successful. Unlike his predecessors, Irvine recognized the need to cultivate cordial relations between the military and the local civilians. But he did like the arrangement, and like the commanders who came before him, Irvine initially failed to comprehend that political authority in the region was based upon the recognition of local agendas, where autonomy and personal liberty were the most important considerations. Moreover, Army leaders like Irvine never succeeded in providing the stable, effective defense that might have generated more consistent local support. While both sides desired stability and protection from Indian attacks, they differed greatly in their estimations of how to accomplish those ends and blamed each other for their failures. While the American victory at Yorktown in October 1781 essentially ended the conflict in the East, the fighting along the frontier continued unabated. Indeed, the final years of conflict were exceedingly difficult for the settlements around Pittsburgh. 5 years of futility and frustration had reduced the locals to a near constant state of despondency and fear. Their greatest source of apprehension was their own inability to defend themselves. Often the only recourse available against an Indian attack was flight. Many settlers simply abandoned their homes and fled back over the mountains, leaving behind worried army commanders who feared the entire frontier might be carried back with the retreating population. Fortunately, the majority of the population did not completely abandon the land. Theirs was a shorter flight. They did often leave their homes and fields, but only for the security of a designated safe point. After the closest community fort became their safe destination, a stockaded cabin or even a fortified mill would do. Hundreds of these small structures sprung up during the war as the settlers sought some measure of defense against Indian attacks. The practice of, quote, forting up provided less security than might be implied. Settlers huddled inside their community stronghouses remained safe only while they remained within the fort, and the practice afforded no protection for their crops, their livestock, or their permanent homes. Nor did the defensive strategy empower locals to thwart the raids. In the Monongahela Valley, Indian raiders routinely attacked homes and killed settlers within sight of the local forts. Skirmishing parties sent out to deflect the attacks met with such resounding defeat that the settlers actually often stopped trying and simply hunkered down in the fort to ride out the attack. Without food or adequate shelter, life inside the overcrowded forts was squalid. Hunger, disease, and death were constant companions. Settlers could not survive inside the forts for an extended period of time, but outside they faced the real threat of death without warning. Periods of apparent calm brought settlers out of the forts to survey the damage or to return to their fields, only to be caught unaware by lurking Indians awaiting an opportunity to strike. We never go to our fields, but we are seized with an involuntary fear which lessens our strength and weakens our labor, a contemporary writer observed. If we stay, we're sure to perish at one time or another. No vigilance on our part can save us. If we retire, we know not where to go. Every house is filled with refugees, as wretched as ourselves. And if we remove, we become beggars. The result was a pervasive sense of dread and helplessness. Avoid this road, good people, a warning scrawled at the entrance to one such beleaguered community read, for the Indians are out murdering us. This psychological and physical paralysis, in turn, manifested the settlers' localized worldview. The ideological underpinnings of the revolution were idle chatter to frontier residents plagued by a war they seemed incapable of winning. For them, the revolution brought only uncertainty, fear, and death. Burdened by fear and beaten into despondency by war, they saw themselves not as rebellious and anti-authoritarian, but rather as the victims of an uncaring government who had sentenced them to die. Many settlers fled or fortied up. That's forted. Throughout the summer and fall of 1782, settlers demanded that Irvine take action. Irvine received at least 5 separate petitions during this time, all asking him to destroy the Indian towns in Ohio country and promising to raise the necessary men for the campaign. In response, Irvine pursued what must have seemed like the only course of action open to him. In order to restore some semblance of order, he embraced the local population's calls for campaigns against the Indians. Irvine's new attitude toward the locals seemed to have won him some immediate support. He informed Washington in late April that I had a meeting of the county lieutenants, with whom I have made arrangements for defending their frontiers, and who promised to exert themselves in drawing out the militia, agreeably to law, on my requisitions. Together, Irvine and the militia leaders developed a coordinated plan for defense of the region. Irvine's Continental Regulars would garrison Forts Pitt and McIntosh, while 2 companies of Pennsylvania militia would cover the region from the Allegheny River to Laurel Hill, and 3 companies of Virginia men would patrol the Ohio River along the Panhandle region of present-day West Virginia. But the war unexpectedly ended before these measures could bear any fruit. Late in 1782, British Commander-in-Chief Sir Guy Carleton ordered the garrisons of Detroit and Niagara to recall their Indian war parties and cease their attacks on the frontier. The Continental Congress countered by ordering American commanders to cancel all offensive measures pending the result of peace negotiations in Paris. And with the exception of a few sporadic raids, the war came to an abrupt halt just as the killing frenzy had reached its zenith. For the local population, it was yet another example of the duplicity of a national government that claimed to care about their interests, yet denied their right to avenge their deceased kin. Frustrated in their efforts to exact revenge against their Indian enemies, the frontier population then blamed the national government, via its Continental Army commander at Pittsburgh, for their suffering and distress. Theirs had become a culture of victimization, in which they faced enemies, real or imagined, at every turn. Constructed from the failure of government and themselves to ensure security, and the perceived attempts of extra-regional authorities to restrain their personal liberty, this frontier mentality had dominated their response to the war and would continue to play an important role in the region's history for many years to come. In April 1783, Irvine confirmed as much after Indian raids resumed in the settlements around Pittsburgh. I presume this conduct will give force to a temper already pretty prevalent among the back settlers, never to make peace with Indians, he informed Washington. Indeed, I am almost persuaded it will be next to impossible to ensure peace with them until the whole of the western tribes are driven over the Mississippi. Indeed, it would take many years, and the eventual removal of all Indians from the region to truly ease the contention on the western Pennsylvania frontier. Even then, sporadic episodes of violence and resistance to state and national political authority would continue to characterize the region for many years afterward.